Um, okay, so um, I'm there. There are people here are who already probably know all sorts of the things I will touch upon, and
I've got.
I'm going to I have one of the horrible PowerPoints. Um, I'll go to one website, but there are some things that I will talk about, some things I will only touch upon passing through, because there are all sorts of wonderful things that can be talked about that have to do, the kind of, they have to do with method diagrams and terminology and things that ringers talk about, but often don't explain. And some of the things that Don talked about in his session kind of are in here as well. What I don't know is if, so my thought is that if there are things that people would like to talk about, which can be dialogue as well as monologue by me, um, that I will try and stop and find out. And if you have questions, to go ahead and ask them. With luck, somebody will nudge me if there's something in the chat, as there was before I turned my speakers up, say there's a question in there. Let's see. So let me get rid of that. Okay. So I will share screen and I will begin. Okay, with luck, people have this. So, oops, go back. We're not ready for that. There are, and let me close this so I can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So this is partly, there's a little bit of tiny bit of history that'll appear in here. When I first started ringing, kind of there weren't a lot of ringing books. There weren't any online resources. There weren't smartphones. And the thing that we first, I guess, really discovered after, the rare books that we had at the cathedral, but were hard to get because they came from England, was the Ringer's Diary, which I am guessing that some of the people who are watching today have no idea what I'm talking about, but it was the handy little, 3 by 3 by 5 kind of diary that in the old days was leather covered and fit in a pocket and had the only kind of methods we'd be learning at the beginning, and had other stuff associated with them that we didn't know about, and had a weekly calendar, and had listed all of the societies and their representatives. And since then, we still, I think, I don't know whether newer ringers do, but certainly people who've been around a while talk about the diagrams in the diary and what do all the things mean. So I am starting from there. And I realized when I was thinking about this that some of the things that people use all the time now, and I think of diagrams and methodology and mobile, the things that they carry around with them, present things in somewhat modified versions, but some of what I'm showing people may or may not have encountered, and some of it they will have. Okay, so I think I skipped, nope, I guess not. Okay, so the things that I'm going to talk about are method diagrams and what the numbers, letters, lines mean in them. Place notation, a very short explanation. Some of the key terms and concepts that we use, and really anyhow helpful is to have resources that I can go back to and check when I don't remember, I can't remember what something means, or there's a new term and I want to find it. So I have at the end some links to some of the resources. There are tons of things out there. And sometimes it's actually hard not to get sort of overwhelmed with how many resources there are. Okay, so move. In method diagrams, there are numbers, lines, bell start positions, lead head, which is something that's not defined at all, but is there. Calling positions, place notation, bobs and singles. Okay, this is a diagram of plain bob major from the 2001 diary. And I'm saying that here's some more of the history. You'll note, I'm assuming everybody has seen a method diagram and they know that this thick black line is the line that all of the bells are following. Oops, sorry, starting at dear. My keys are more powerful than I realized. That everybody follows. Before I talk about all the arrows, I want to say one of the things that I confirmed that had been my impression is that in the old days, methods in the diary were always shown from the perspective of the tenor. So this plain bob major shows the line starting at the 8. And it really doesn't matter at one level which bell the lines is drawn through. However, if you become accustomed to learning it from a particular bell, there are things as you move on to learning things that are, for me anyhow, I learn in reference to that particular bell. So when the diagram starts at a different place and rounds and the line start from the 2 or the 3, it throws off some of what I'm looking for. So there are funny things like that that occur as you start to learn methods and expand into multiple things. Okay, so in the diagram, there are the rows of changes, all the numbers, obviously, starting with rounds. The blue line, which the diary was not in color, so is the heavy black line. The treble line, which we are accustomed to seeing in red, which is, of course, the thinner line that runs through the treble. Then there are the bell start positions. And I'm guessing that all of you realize that in method diagrams, this circled number is the start position for the various, in this case, 8 bells that are ringing the method, where they start on the blue line. And I know for some people when they're first learning, they don't know that. I'm guessing all of you do because you've been ringing for a little while. And most of the method diagrams that show all of the numbers still do seem to use the circled number to indicate where a bell starts its work. The lead heads are the treble's backstroke leads, and in most of the diagrams we see, they come below the horizontal line. When I was learning to ring, we, for whatever reason, were taught that this horizontal line went below the treble's second lead, below its backstroke lead. So I still tend to diagram things that way. But it's worth knowing that this is officially called the lead head. In ringing practice, I think most of us in North America refer to it as the lead end, particularly when we're actively ringing and trying to get everybody straight, and we say, this is the lead end, we mean this backstroke of the treble. Calling positions are the letters, and in this case, numbers, like fourths and fifths, that are over to the right of the changes. These are showing, if you notice, there's a W, this first one, with a hyphen before it, and that hyphen is really kind of pointing at the particular row, which is the row of the method at which the call is made. So in Plain Bob, this is telling me that if I make a call, a bob or a single at this point, this is where I'm going to make it when the treble's in seconds place. And this designation, this W, which we'll get to later, tells me something about where the position is within both compositions and within the method. And what it tells me right now, the W briefly stands for wrong, and it is a call which ends up with the tenor bell being in seventh place at the lead end. And that is, in this case, the definition of what that is. And there are other definitions for the other letters. If one of the things that's kind of curious about this, that I perhaps was an errata in this year, you'll notice that there is one of these calling position indicators at before every lead end except this one. So we have one there and there, and that this actually is a valid calling position. So I'm guessing they just forgot to put it in that year. The numbers that are down the side of the changes over here to the left are numbers that indicate the place notation of the method. They, in this version of the diagram, go only down through what's called the half lead, which is when the treble is ringing its backstroke in last place, halfway through its work. And then also it's noted at what I call the lead end, what the place notation is. And combined, we'll talk more, or I'll talk more about place notation later. So this was the 2001 diary. I looked at very quickly at the 2021 diary, where we have gone to computer generation, and it doesn't have the charm of the very thick line and so on. It has much the same information, and I've neglected to mention bobs and singles being also shown. Let me go back before we jump here. So over here, it tells you what happens at calls. So all of this was on a nice, handy, little tiny page that you could carry around and take a quick look at. Same information pretty much is here. The one thing that has been added, and I need to, go away, Zoom, go away. I'm going to, well, down here where I can't see it, in this diagram, sorry, is the lead head group, which is a letter. And if I'm remembering correctly, Plain Bob Major is group A. I can't see it right now, so I may have misremembered. I will touch on those later, but that's helpful information to have. Otherwise, this is pretty similar to the old version, except it's more compact, actually, the way it is now printed. And then there are some other ways that one can also see the diagram. This is from the Blue Line Methods line. Again, much the same. It does not include the lead head group, but otherwise it's the kind of thing we're used to, and it has a real blue line and a real red line, which is nice. Makes them a bit more distinctive. Okay, there are two other types of diagrams of most methods, but in this case, Plain Bob is the example. The one here to the left, which is in, I think, what most of us actually have in our minds, which is the vision of the path we're following without all of the numbers. And within the diary, and also online, a lot of the time you can get this. It too has the circled numbers that indicate where a play spell starts, and there's a little dot over here that corresponds with it, and it shows the treble. Over here and here are two examples of another way of presenting a method, which is the grid, where instead of showing the whole method, one lead of the method is shown, and the line for each bell is drawn in, no numbers, but it gives you a visual kind of overview of how the bells interact. In methods that are more complex than Plain Bob, it can be especially useful to see where bells perhaps turn around in the middle of a lead and go back in the opposite direction, which bells kind of intertwine with each other. Plain Bob, being essentially plain hunt, is very, I suppose, very straight liney. And of course, if you have just the grid, you could work out the whole method from this, because you would simply follow, say, bell 4 from its starting point down to here and see that it has ended up in the 6th place, at which point you then can go back and tag on what the 6th place bell does, and so on, so that you can end up with the whole line in a format like this from just having this single lead of it. One of the things that I'll note here is that this also shows place notation for half of the lead. This version of it shows the place notation for the whole lead. And when we get to place notation, I can talk about that a little bit as well. The other thing in these two examples, at the very top, again, they give place notation, and this is also the lead head group is given, which we'll talk about later. Okay. Now, place notation. Place notation, and the people from Raleigh are familiar with this because I sort of stole these points from a presentation Eddie Futcher did for them a while ago. But it's true. It's a shorthand way of describing a method. And it indicates how bells move between successive rows. It is universally used and accepted within the ringing community, I would say. Probably outside of it, nobody would understand what it was at all. It gives an insight into the way a method is constructed. And there are some ringers who just learn the place notation to learn a method. I would say generally, we don't recommend that as the first way to learn to ring, but I am guessing that for some people, even at the beginning, that may be, our minds all work differently. So for some people, that may, even at the beginning, be the best way to learn. But for those of us who have not really done much with it, place notation or encountered it, it can still be a handy little thing if you know what perhaps the very first place being made in a method is. It can help you remember how to start a method, at which point you're fine. So there are things about place notation that even if you don't make regular use of it, as some ringers do, it can be handy to be aware of and notice about a method. What it looks like, there's some variation. There are multiple formats for it. And here I've shown Plain Bob Major, which is very boring in place notation compared to some methods. But given that I had the diagrams of that, I've decided I'd stick with it. But it's possible to show place notation for every change of a method or every place, which this does. And strangely enough, so does this second version, which looks quite different from the first version. Or because most of our methods are, the methods that we ring are symmetric around the half lead, you can show place notation for the first half of a lead. And then after, in this case, the comma, you say what the lead end notation is. And to create the whole lead of the method, you go through this in one direction, and then you go, back through it. And at this point, you put on the lead end. So it's something that, as we look at it with a shorter method, will become clearer. So a friendly method to look at is Plain Bob Minimus. That is, I guess it's often used with people when they do initial presentations about place notation. And we know how the method works. Again, the place notation is kind of boring because all the numbers look the same. But Plain Bob Minimus alternates between both pairs of bells swapping positions as they go from rounds to the first change. So right here, we start in rounds, and at the first change, 2, 1, 4, 3, the first pair of bells swaps positions, and the second pair of bells swaps positions. And we kind of interchangeably will use the term swap and cross. However, in place notation, a very common way of denoting that action is with an X. So what this X is saying is to get from rounds to the next change, every pair of bells is going to cross. And if we were doing it on 8 bells and you had an X, the 1, 2 would swap positions, the 3, 4 would swap across, the 5, 6, and the 7, 8. At the next change, the bells in first and fourth place make places. They stay there. So the 2 has gone into first place. It stays there to finish its lead. I just lost my cursor there. The 3 has gone into fourth place. It stays there to make a place. Well, it's in fourth place. The 2 was in first place. The place notation is 1, 4. So that denotes the position in which the place is made, not what bell is making it, but the position. And the other pairs of bells swap or cross. And that's a given, so you don't have extra X's thrown in here. But the only way not to repeat a change, if this is staying here and the 3 is staying there, is for these 2 bells to cross over. So when places are made, pairs of bells that are between the places will cross. Then the next transition from the 2, 4, 1, 3 row is another cross. So the bells in first and second places cross, and the bells in third and fourth cross. And we then have another 1, 4, and so on until we get down to when the treble gets to lead. And instead of doing what we've been doing, a 1, 4, which would give us plain hunt, seconds is made, which is again denoted by 1, 2. And the bells that are outside of those 2 bells making places dodge. So the bells in 3, 4 dodge. And you continue doing this until you get back to rounds, essentially. I'm going to go on to another method to look at that is a little more interesting from a place notation perspective than plain bob. And this is something that we can, if people want to, we can try to do this online, or you can just try and do it yourself at some point. But this is kind of, so this is a minor method, and it has the place notation listed both up the top and over here to the side. That's telling me, starting from rounds, the first thing that's going to happen is the cross. So the pairs of bells in the first 2 places cross over, in 3, 4 crossover, and in 5, 6 crossover. At the next transition from this hand stroke to this backstroke, whatever bell was in first is going to stay there, and whatever bell's in fourth is going to stay there. And the bells that were in 2 and 3 will cross, and the bells that were in 5 and 6 will cross. And then at the next change, we cross all of the pairs. So from whoever's in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, and so on down to the half lead. At which point, to continue, the next thing I would write of the notation, I would then kind of work backwards through this. I'd put an X here, then a 3, 6 would come down here, then another X, cushion, a 1, 4, and finally another cross. And at the lead end, in first place and sixth place is made. Given the place notation, just this information, you can find out a method's name at various places. One handy one, I have a link here, and I give it later as well, so that you could see what you came up with as the what the first lead of this method is, and then by using the place notation, which you know, you could check whether what you ended up with was correct. And could also find out the name of the method. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick stop of going through the slides and see if people have some questions or additional information they'd like to throw into the hopper at this point. And you can, it's fine to go ahead and talk, or I can see if there are things in the chat. Oh, I would be honored, Matt. So, yes, they are still, so somebody comment on the diaries. They are still in leather covered, but they were much nicer. They were pigskin and they were soft. And oh, they were so lovely, the original old diaries. That was a tangent. So does anybody have any questions about place notation that they'd like to voice, or about the method diagrams that they'd like to voice? If not, I will continue merrily along my way.
So just want to make sure I've caught something correctly, Quilla. You know, I was originally told that the lead end was that row that we encounter after the treble, as the treble has led its second time, so the end of the treble's lead, but it's really one ahead of there, is what you're saying. It's the
yes,
end, you know, the lead being the structure, this whole structure, and it's the end of this portion of the method.
The thing, it is a technical terminology issue. And when I get into the next place where I talk about terms, so there are lead ends and there are lead heads. Technically, rounds is called a lead head, and it is before, if we were doing plain hunt, the hand stroke before we then get back to rounds is technically called the lead end. However, in general parlance in North America and most other places I'm aware of, in my experience, but I have more North American experience. If somebody says, this is the lead end, we are talking about the backstroke, the place where you need, there are situations where you need to realize whether they're using the technical term or the term that we generally use. And for example, when I talked about lead head groups, that group A designation, those lead heads are what we call lead ends. They are the backstrokes, but it is referred to as a lead head group. So you want to realize that that's what it is. But I would say, if I'm telling somebody you need to know where you are at the lead end, I mean the treble's backstroke lead, and that is where you become a new place bell and take on kind of, you know, a new role. So does that make it murkier or clearer?
It explains the murkiness.
Okay. That's a fair answer. Okay. All right. So place notation, before I go on, it really is, when you think about it, it's really neat that you can describe, in this case, for this method, we're describing a method which is a minor, it's a plain hunting minor method. So 60 changes are described in this, you know, by these numbers, which is really kind of a nifty little thing. Okay. Oop, let me get back to the right screen and close this. Okay, key terms and concepts. So a really handy reference is John Harrison's Glossary of Ringing Terms, and this is an active link in this presentation, but I will include the actual URL if anybody wants it, because it includes some bare bones definitions, which are usually, I don't want a lot of information, I just want to know what is this. But sometimes it's helpful to have a bit of background, and he manages to do that in a number of cases without going to excessive length. So it can be, you know, it kind of helps explain things. Tell you what it is, but here's a little bit more. And these are, so we in ringing have jargon, and we also use words in multiple ways, and we don't always tell people what these multiple ways are. So we can be talking about a course, and they think we mean one thing and we mean something else. So course is, and these definitions are from Harrison's glossary, is I like the idea of the natural length of a method or principle without calls. So essentially a course, well, is initially it's the playing course of the method. So when you ring plain bob, it's getting through plain bob minor, getting through all 5 leads of plain bob minor, for example. But if you call a touch, you have, in this case, he gives an example, you can have what's called a bob course, a touch lasting maybe roughly as long as a plain course, or sometimes it's much shorter. So in plain bob minor, a bob course is actually 3 leads rather than 5 leads, so it's shorter, but it gets you back to rounds. So essentially you're going from rounds, you get back to rounds. In that case, it's a course. Within a touch, a course is usually going to be the leads between when the tenor is in last place at home, or an observation bell, which we'll mention later, and it then gets back there. So if you're ringing a touch and the tenor is unaffected by any calls, a course will be the same length as a plain course, because the tenor will be back in its home position, back in last place, the same number of leads later, because it's just rung a plain course, although other bells may be affected. And in touches, you have multiple, you may have multiple courses. You can have a touch that is only 1 course long, where that course may be slightly longer than a plain course, but again, the tenor only gets back to its home place once. Course, the verb is the act of following another bell up and down through the work. So for those of you who were at Don's presentation, and he talks about coursing order, he talked about course bells, I think, as well. So we tend to use it to say, to tell somebody 3 course the 5, or vice versa, depending on whatever's happening. And again, in plain hunt and plain bob, it's a very clear and very linear kind of process. Come back to me. There. Course bell. And eventually we will get to coursing order. The preceding bell in the coursing order. This will make perhaps more sense in a moment. Course and is the row at the end of a course. And it's interesting because I would disagree with it being the hand stroke row of the lead end. I mean, again, just as we say, this is the lead end, meaning a backstroke, if we say this is the course end, we mean a backstroke. So this is a technical definition probably to correspond with lead end being a hand stroke in technical terms. So here we are. This term was formerly used for the course head. Well, we currently use it for that. So course head, what we would call the course end. Coursing is following a bell in the coursing order. Come on. Okay, coursing order. This gets longer. And this is too many words for PowerPoint and for people to read, but coursing order is something that you should read about and think about, and you should memorize what I refer to as the coursing order is. There is a coursing order in most of the methods that we ring. Not Granser is slightly different, which we ring fairly much. Stedman.
Hey, Quilla,
Yes,
are we supposed to be on a different slide?
I went to a different slide.
We're still on the first slide of some key terms and concepts.
Oh, okay. So I've gone again. Yeah, are you still on that same one?
Yes. Maybe
That's-
try going out of screen share and coming back in.
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, wait, it says my screen sharing is paused. It says in little letters. So I've never done that.
Ooh.
I don't know. I wonder how you unpause it. Oh, let's try that. No. Huh. How very interesting. Well, let me stop the share and reshare. Thank you, Joseph.
You're welcome. I was hesitant to say something, and then people said stuff. I was like, I should probably bring something up.
Yeah, no, it's good to, no, go ahead and talk to me. I figure, as far as I can tell, there's nobody there. You've all left. Okay, is this coursing order?
Yes, with all the words you got there
Okay,
that you were
yeah.
talking about.
Okay, now you know. Okay, so coursing order is really important. It is really helpful when you're ringing, and it is really helpful. Probably more so. I guess more so if you're conducting, and there are conductors use coursing order, although I'm assuming new young conductors still do, but I know certainly 20 years ago, conductors tended to, by God, they used coursing order and they thought about it a lot. And some of them really, that was how they thought about calling touches and compositions, although all of the notation that is generally published for touches is not written in terms of coursing order, which I've always found interesting. But coursing order is something that in plain bob and plain hunt is very clear. It is synonymous with the order in which the bells lead. So the bells get to the front in the coursing order, they get to the back in the coursing order. And as you get into that will change. They may not be together at the front. They may not be together at the back, but there is this sort of buddy relationship between two bells who are in course with each other that makes them bells that you can rely on in a similar fashion to relying on the treble. So there are things that you watch for. Am I meeting my course bell where I have learned I should be meeting it in this method? One of the, I'm trying to think if, no, I was going to talk about the lead head transformation, but I don't think I will. But coursing order is something to read about and think about. And what doesn't always happen, I think, with ringers is to ask questions about it. I think experienced ringers often forget to explain things. And beginning ringers often don't ask, perhaps because there aren't good times to ask it. You know, unless you have a group who really reliably goes to the pub where things get chatted about, you can't ask sometimes during practice because everybody's ringing. And I think one of the nice things that has come along with all of the virtual ringing is that we have more time for questions and stuff. Okay, so I need to move along because I'm taking too long. So let me move quickly. Maybe if it doesn't pause again. Good, okay. Lead end and lead head, I've talked about. Here are the definitions again. Technically, the lead head is the lead end is the hand stroke. Technically, the lead head is the backstroke of the treble's lead. We in general parlance don't talk about lead head. You know, that term, I had never heard that term for years of ringing. But lead end, we tend in tower practice, we mean the treble's backstroke lead. Now, lead head code is this nifty thing that can be really confusing, but you'll see it showing up more and more as it does in some of the diagrams, where most of the methods we ring, they're the lead ends in our tower terminology, so the treble's backstroke lead, are, although the methods have all sorts of complexity in them, those lead ends are the same as the lead ends that you can, and they, however, they don't always, within a method, they may come in, you may encounter them in a different order from the order in which you encounter them in plain Bob. And methods are grouped that way. So for example, there are some methods that have a plain Bob lead end order. There are, which is to say, if you're the 2, the next time you're going to be the 4, then you're going to be the 6, and so on. There are some methods such as Cambridge, where if you are the 2, the next lead end, you will become the 6. And then it, you know, depends whether it's major or minor or higher numbers. And there's some like London where if you are the 2, what you become at the first lead end is the 3. So methods get grouped by which of these characteristics, which of lead end order they are in. And that affects primarily compositions in which there are touches which, if you are ringing a method that is in one lead head group, that touch will not give you the same number of changes as it would if you rang it in a different lead head group. So there, in the diary now, there are some places where they actually list things by lead head group. And it's an interesting thing that you probably don't need to worry about right now, but you may bump into it or hear it mentioned. One important thing that has to do with lead order is that it is not the same as coursing order. In plain Bob, the lead order is, if I start with the 2, 2, 4, 6, I'm going up to major, 8, 7, 5, 3. That happens also to be what the coursing order is. That is a coincidence, I'll say. They are two different things, and it's good to separate to make sure you know that, because people will expect you to do something related to the coursing order. And if you're ringing, say, Cambridge, or if you're ringing Kent, that is not the same as the lead order. So just the fact that they are two different things is good to know. Dear me, observation bell is a working bell, and this gets into touches and things whose position is used by the, essentially as a reference point by the conductor, I'll say. Okay. Notation of calls. Now, we are getting, we have, it's 6 o'clock. By the interval between the calls, so which is particularly used in Granser, and the sequence of bells that do particular work, which is also used sometimes in Granser. Now I'm recording, if I'm recording, let me make this smaller. Okay, so that this is visible. Okay, most of what, other than Granser and Stedman, the rules that use the kind of notation that I showed in the diary, the W, H, M, 4/5, and so on, are even bell methods. So even bell compositions, as this says, are usually notated by the positions of an observation bell, which is, at least when we start calling, if we're first learning, is usually the tenor. And the calling positions are, H stands for home, which is the tenor's home plate, home position. So, you know, it looks gobbledygook, nth place, i.e., but it means if we're ringing on major, it's when the tenor's back and becoming 8th place bell. If you're ringing minor, it's when the 6 is becoming 6th place bell, and so on. The wrong is the tenor at the back, and this says dodging at the back. Well, it isn't necessarily dodging, because if you're in a method where you don't dodge at the lead end, it's that you are in 7th place at the lead end. So you are in that pair of 7, 8, but you're in the wrong place. You're not at your home place. So that's what the wrong is. Right, I have never encountered right, but it makes sense that it's, if wrong is wrong, then, you know, the opposite must be right. It's the alternative to home. Then there's before, which is the same as out. Those two are both used interchangeably. Usually, well, I wouldn't say interchangeably. They signify the same thing. And in some methods, people refer to it as a before, and in some methods, it's an out, I guess is what I'd say. But if essentially it means that is the bell whom the treble turns from lead is what the before and the out are. I stands for in, which refers to running in, and F is fourths for make the bob. M is middle, which I suppose partly because we do a lot of eight bell ringing, I think of it as always meaning it's 5, 6 down, but you can have a middle on a higher number of bells, and it is the position kind of immediately, it's the position before the home position, meaning not what place bell you necessarily are before it, but it's 6th place, for example, or on 10, it would be 8th place. V stands for fifths, meaning you're in 5th place at the trebles backstroke lead. And if you, here are the positions shown with minor, major, and royal, and what position you would be in if a call were being, what position the tenor would be in if a call were made at that position. As you get beyond major, there need to be additional positions for terms for the calling positions that don't exist in major. And for old-fashioned compositions, there wouldn't be a lot of those. With more compositions that are doing cyclic things where they rotate bells around and the tenor doesn't even necessarily, a course does not involve the tenor getting back to its home position. There are calls that happen all over the place, but in older compositions, there wouldn't have been a lot of calls in these extra calling positions. Okay. Now, to show some of the different ways touches can be notated or looked at if you're trying to understand what a touch is. This is one of the standard 120s of plain bob minor, and it is called by calling a bob when the 6 is in the wrong position, then calling another one when it's in its home position, and then doing the same thing again, where the wrong position is when the tenor is going to become 5th place bell. So it's the first lead end of the method. And the home position is when it's back in doing its 5, 6 down dodge. The tenor in this is unaffected. So the course is a whole 5 leads. And I show sort of 8 ways of kind of looking at it. The first one shows W and H, and I never wrote it out because sometimes people will write it out, and we will often, you may have heard people say in the tower, call wrong home. And so we tend to say the words when we're talking about it, but if you're writing it out, you normally just use the W and H. So WH times 2 means make a call wrong, make a call home, and do it again. And you could also say wrong home, or WH, as I did. The third way is a more standard kind of the composition that you will see for longer touches and some shorter ones in the diary and other places, where the numbers to the left are, the first one is grounds, and we don't worry about the one because we know it's always there. The second number is the lead end at the end of that first course. So the first time the tenor gets back to home place, that's the lead end that you should get. And the second row, which is rounds, below the top line, is rounds, because that's what you get back to.
So, Quilla, can I pop in with a question?
Yeah.
So that sequence of numbers all the way on the left is
Yep.
showing me the lead end after the effects of all of the calls that are indicated to the right.
That's correct.
Okay.
And something that can sometimes be confusing, if, for example, you had only one, if in this first row, I only called a wrong, not a wrong and a home, I would still, that number over to the left, it would be different from what it is now, but it would still be the number when the tenor is at home, because you can see there's the tenor in last place. So
even with the omitted, if you will, the omitted call.
yeah, I mean, it would be a different number, but it is the course end. As we get into course ends and course heads, it is the course end change is what's shown here, not the change, not the lead as of the last call that was made. It is the lead end when the tenor is back at home, which may not have been the you may have had the final call be an earlier call.
Right.
Yeah. The fourth one is saying it is abbreviated somewhat from the top one, and it says repeat once. And the reason I included this was it's not as obvious here, but I always have to think twice. In the diary and some other places, they will sometimes, they'll show, a series of calls, and they get repeated however many times, and below it says repeat twice. Well, what that really means is you have,
I mean, 2 or 3 times.
yes, exactly, and it means you have to call it 3 times, because they mean call it once, then do it twice more, which is why I prefer number 5, if I'm going to get into that, where it tells me, honey, this is how many parts there are. You don't have to figure out whether once means it's only done once, or or whatever. So again, then number 6 is simply doing it by every lead end, which you wouldn't want to do for a long touch, but for short ones you can. So it's Bob, plain, 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 Bob times 2, or Bob, plain, 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 Bob, Bob, plain, 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 Bob, are other ways of notating it. And if you really want to figure out, make sure you're getting, all the lead ends right and want to think about it, you can write out every lead end and confirm that you have gotten at least your first course end was right. The 1, 4, 5, 2, 3, 6, and you did get back to rounds the second time. And writing out the lead ends is something that sometimes is, at least for me, I still, if I'm looking at grand surtouches, I have an abbreviated way of looking at the lead ends, but I need to sometimes get every one of them in there, partly because people sometimes seem to specify things slightly differently from what I expect. And if and you can work backwards and figure out what the calling is supposed to be by telling, where how do I get to this lead end they've told me I should be at, what do I need to do to get there? And it can clarify for you what the composition really is supposed to look like, as opposed to what you thought it was. Okay. Okay, now we get into the useful online links. So reading and interpreting the diagram. Now I wanted to, let me see if I can, I think I have this here. Do I still have him? No, I've hidden him. Okay, well, let's see. This looks weird, but I'm going to do this. Oh, it didn't do it. Let's try this again. Dum dum.
You lost share screen.
Yeah, I know. I hit the wrong thing. So I'll come back to that after I try to go here. Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the first thing that I've talked about. This is really very nicely done talk about the diagram format. The people who are here now know most of this, but this can be handy for other people. So this is Steve Scanlon's site that has some other handy diagrams for learners. And if one goes to the menu, he has learning, he has some exercises here. He has information about methods that can be handy. But this is a pretty clear, the diagram format. He talks about places and who to follow, circle of work in the diagram, bobs and singles, and how to understand what they are. Because I think people sometimes when they first look at the abbreviated bob and single can't figure out how that fits into the method, the plain course of the method. And then very briefly, he talks about place notation. So, okay, so let me do back to here. There. Come on. So we should be back if I can get it moved. Okay, I think we're useful online links is back.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the reading and interpreting the diagram. Place notation. So one of the things that Laura mentioned in the chat and Mark's talk this morning, if you haven't looked at his masterclass series, look at them. If you don't care about Methodoku, speed up the sound until you get to something that is a little, that has to do with ringing as opposed to how to solve or create a Methodoku, because he talks about in wonderfully simple ways some concepts. So the first one in his number 2 video, he gives a really nice friendly explanation of place notation, kind of looking at in reverse. Here is the method and let's derive the place notation from the method rather than deriving the method from the place notation. But that, I think in some ways, is clearer for people to really see. He has another one, I think in Methodoku or Masterclass number 4, where he talks about lead-end transposition, and transposition. And again, it just kind of comes in, and it's a concept that we don't talk about and that people don't understand. And transposition comes into play in all sorts of different ways within ringing. So it's a great one to start to see how useful it is. So I think his master classes are great, and they're short. I mean, one of them, I think the longest one is maybe half an hour. So they're then, as I had said before at the beginning, John Harrison's glossary of ringing terms is a really handy reference to have. Let's see, I have some chat. Do any of these matter? Oh, okay. And
No, they do not, Quilla.
No, but I agree. I'd love some. And LEAD had groups, this whole thing of A, A, B, C, D, and they go on to amazing numbers. And it is something which, if you want to spend a little time thinking, it's worth looking into. But at least for me, the first time I really sat down with one of these, I had to really think about it for a little while. But there are various things that talk about it. And it's an interesting one to look at. And then notation of calls, there's the reference for that. So those were the things I had.